The smoke was still rising from the forward operating base when Captain Marcus Holloway made his declaration. Standing beside the bombed-out control tower, his weathered face etched with frustration, he gestured toward the cratered airstrip that stretched like a broken spine across the Afghan desert. "No way in hell," he muttered into his radio, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years in the Air Force. "That strip's maybe 800 meters of usable runway, and half of it's got potholes deep enough to swallow a Humvee. You'd have to be certifiably insane to try landing anything bigger than a drone on that death trap." The Taliban had done their work well during the night raid. What had been a functional, if modest, airfield 12 hours ago now resembled the surface of the moon. Mortar rounds had chewed up the asphalt in precise intervals, turning the landing zone into a minefield of twisted metal and concrete debris. The control tower's windows stared out like dead eyes, and the fuel depot continued to belch oily black smoke into the crystalline morning sky. 3 wounded Marines lay in the medical tent, their conditions deteriorating by the hour, while ammunition supplies dwindled to dangerous levels. But somewhere high above the Helmand Valley, at 35,000 feet and climbing, Lieutenant Colonel Vera Tombstone Kozlowski was already calculating approach vectors on her mission computer. The A-10 Thunderbolt II responded to her touch like a familiar dance partner, its twin engines humming their distinctive whine as she banked northeast toward Grid Square 42, STD 12,340, 567,890. Her call sign had nothing to do with death, despite what the newer pilots whispered in the ready room. It came from her habit of marking every successful mission with a small stone placed on her desk, a ritual that had started in Iraq and followed her through 3 deployments. "Tombstone 27, this is Overlord Actual," the radio crackled in her helmet. "Be advised, LZ is heavily damaged. Local commander reports runway unsuitable for fixed-wing aircraft. Recommend you abort an RTB." Vera's gloved fingers tightened on the stick as she descended through 28,000 feet. Through her cockpit canopy, the mountains of Afghanistan spread below like ancient teeth, their snow-capped peaks catching the early sunlight. She had studied the reconnaissance photos during her pre-flight briefing, memorizing every crater, every debris field, every inch of that impossible strip. The math was unforgiving. Her A-10 needed at least 1,200 meters for a safe landing under ideal conditions. What waited below offered barely 2/3 of that distance, and nothing about those conditions could be called ideal. "Copy that, Overlord. Tombstone 27 continuing inbound for visual assessment. Will advise." She had logged over 4,000 flight hours in the Warthog, from the sand-swept airfields of Iraq to the mountain valleys of Afghanistan. She knew every rivet, every system, every quirk of the aircraft that had earned its fearsome reputation as a tank killer and troop saver. But more importantly, she knew something that Captain Holloway and his doubters on the ground couldn't see from their crater-scarred vantage point. Sometimes impossible was just another word for untested. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Vera began her descent toward the forward operating base, the damaged airstrip growing larger in her windscreen with each passing second. At 15,000 feet, she could make out the full extent of the destruction. Twisted metal scattered like deadly confetti, chunks of concrete that had been hurled 50 meters from their original positions, and the unmistakable black scars where explosives had found their mark. The Taliban had been thorough, methodical in their sabotage, but they had also made one critical miscalculation. "Tombstone 27, this is Python lead on deck," came a gravelly voice over the radio. Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, the forward air controller assigned to the base, had been coordinating close air support missions for the better part of a decade. His voice carried the tension of a man watching his options dwindle with each passing hour. "I've got eyes on your bird from the tower. That strip is completely fucked over." Vera keyed her mic, keeping her voice steady and professional despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. "Python lead, Tombstone 27. I copy your assessment. Request permission to make a low pass for personal visual confirmation." There was a pause, filled with static and the distant sound of small arms fire echoing across the valley. When Santos came back on the radio, his skepticism was palpable. "Tombstone, be my guest. But I'm telling you right now, there's no way you're getting that hog down in one piece. The longest clear section I can measure is maybe 600 meters, and that's being generous." As Vera dropped below 10,000 feet, the details of the base became sharper, more personal. She could see individual soldiers moving between bunkers, their desert camouflage blending with the sun-bleached landscape. Medical personnel scurried around the aid station, their urgency visible even from altitude. Near the motor pool, mechanics worked frantically to repair damaged vehicles, their tools glinting in the harsh sunlight. This wasn't just a tactical problem anymore. It was personal. Every second she spent circling overhead was another second. Those wounded Marines below were bleeding out. The A-10's distinctive profile cast a shadow across the valley as she leveled off at 2,000 feet, beginning her reconnaissance pass. Her trained eye cataloged every obstacle: a burned-out fuel truck blocking the eastern approach, scattered concrete barriers that had been blown from their positions, and a series of impact craters that formed an almost perfect line down the center of the runway. But she also noted something else, something that the ground-based observers couldn't see from their limited perspective. The western edge of the strip, closest to the mountain face, remained largely intact. It was narrow, barely wide enough for her aircraft, but it was smooth. More importantly, it offered a natural upslope that could help with braking. The challenge would be threading the needle between the obstacles while maintaining enough speed to avoid stalling, then somehow bringing 30,000 pounds of military aircraft to a controlled stop before running out of real estate. Her flight computer began calculating approach angles and descent rates, but Vera had already made her decision. She pulled back on the stick, climbing away from the valley floor as she began to formulate a plan that would either save lives or end her career, possibly both. Captain Holloway stood in the shadow of the damaged control tower, his binoculars trained on the A-10 as it completed its reconnaissance pass. Around him, a small crowd of Marines and Air Force personnel had gathered, drawn by the spectacle of watching a pilot contemplate what most considered an impossible landing. The conversation was a mixture of professional assessment and gallows humor, the kind of dark commentary that sustained military personnel in hopeless situations. "She's definitely got balls, I'll give her that," muttered Corporal Davidson, a crew chief whose own aircraft had been destroyed in the overnight attack. "But balls don't change physics. That bird needs room to break, and we've got about as much runway left as a Walmart parking lot." Sergeant Major Rodriguez, the senior enlisted man on base, spat into the dust and adjusted his body armor. He had seen enough impossible situations to know that sometimes the word itself was just an opinion. "I've seen that pilot's record," he said quietly. "Lieutenant Colonel Kozlowski. They don't give someone a call sign like Tombstone for being reckless. She's got something in mind." High above, Vera was indeed calculating something that others might consider reckless, but she knew it was precision disguised as madness. The A-10 had been designed for exactly this kind of mission: short, rough field operations where conventional aircraft couldn't go. Its titanium bathtub cockpit, redundant systems, and rugged landing gear had been engineered to handle punishment. More importantly, she had trained for scenarios exactly like this one at the Air Force Weapons School, practicing emergency landings on damaged runways until the procedures became muscle memory. She keyed her radio, her voice calm and measured. "Python lead, Tombstone 27. I'm declaring emergency landing authority under combat mission rules, clearing the pattern for approach." "Tombstone negative." Santos's response was immediate and sharp. "I cannot authorize that landing. The risk is too high. We'll find another way to get supplies and medevac." But Vera was already entering her approach pattern, configuring her aircraft for the most challenging landing of her career. Python lead, I'm not requesting authorization. I'm informing you of my intentions. Clear all personnel from the runway area and have medical standing by. Tombstone 27 inbound, final approach. Below, Captain Holloway lowered his binoculars with the expression of a man watching history unfold, uncertain whether it would be triumph or tragedy. The mathematics of death hung in the air like a curse as Vera configured her A-10 for final approach. At 1,200 feet above ground level, she could see every jagged piece of concrete, every twisted metal obstacle that lay between her aircraft and the impossibly short strip below. Her airspeed indicator showed 160 knots, already slower than she would prefer for a normal approach, but physics demanded compromise when attempting the impossible. Tombstone 27, final approach, she transmitted, her voice betraying none of the calculations racing through her mind. The A-10's landing gear extended with their familiar thunk, followed by the whine of flaps deploying to maximum extension. Every system on the aircraft was now configured for a landing that existed at the very edge of the performance envelope, a place where pilot skill would matter more than engineering specifications. Staff Sergeant Santos watched through his binoculars from the control tower, his radio silent but his thoughts racing. In 15 years of forward air control, he had never seen a pilot attempt something this audacious. The longest section of intact runway measured precisely 640 meters by his laser rangefinder, barely half of what the A-10's technical manual specified for safe landing distance. But technical manuals, he knew, were written by engineers who had never watched Marines bleed out in a forward aid station, while medevac helicopters remained grounded by enemy fire. At 800 feet, Vera began her descent into what pilots call the coffin corner, the narrow intersection of speed, altitude, and runway distance, where survival balanced on the knife's edge of perfect execution. Her approach angle was steep, steeper than any textbook landing, designed to minimize the distance required while maintaining enough energy to recover if something went wrong. The mountain faces on either side of the valley created a natural corridor that funneled wind and thermals in unpredictable patterns, making precise control even more challenging. "Come on, Tombstone," whispered Sergeant Major Rodriguez from the ground, though his words were lost in the growing roar of twin turbofan engines. "Show these boys how it's done." The A-10's distinctive profile grew larger against the desert sky, its titanium nose pointing toward a strip of broken asphalt that looked more like a war zone than a runway. Vera's hands moved with practiced precision across her controls, throttles back to flight idle, stick pressure, adjusted for the crosswind component, rudder inputs to maintain centerline alignment despite the gusting valley winds. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, the result of thousands of hours spent mastering an aircraft that had been designed to survive in environments where other planes couldn't operate. At 400 feet, she crossed the ridgeline that marked the final approach corridor, the point of no return where physics took over from intention. Below, the runway rushed toward her aircraft with terrifying speed, each crater and debris field marking another obstacle to overcome. But Vera's focus had narrowed to a single point, the upsloping section of intact asphalt that represented her target touchdown zone, a narrow strip of possibility in a field of destruction. Her training had taught her that landing was controlled crashing, but this approach demanded something beyond control. It required faith in her aircraft, trust in her skills, and acceptance that some risks could only be taken by those willing to pay the ultimate price for the lives waiting below. The moment of truth arrived with the whisper of rubber meeting damaged asphalt. Vera's main landing gear touched down precisely on her planned touchdown point, 600 meters from the mountain face that marked the beginning of the usable runway. But touchdown was only the first challenge. Now came the test of whether 30,000 pounds of military aircraft could be brought to a controlled stop before running out of ground to forgive mistakes. The A-10 settled onto the runway with surprising grace, but grace was a luxury that lasted only seconds. Vera immediately deployed her aircraft's drag chute, feeling the familiar tug as the parachute filled with air, and began its work of converting forward momentum into manageable deceleration. Simultaneously, her feet found the wheel brakes, applying pressure in carefully measured intervals to avoid locking the tires and losing directional control on the debris-littered surface. "Holy shit, she's down." Santos's voice crackled over the radio, professional composure momentarily abandoned as he watched the impossible become reality. Around the base, personnel who had gathered to witness either triumph or disaster found themselves holding their breath as the drama played out before them. The runway surface beneath her wheels was far from ideal. Chunks of concrete knocked loose by mortar impacts created a constant vibration that rattled through the airframe, while metal debris sparked against her landing gear as she rolled through the destruction. Vera fought to maintain centerline position, using differential braking and rudder inputs to keep her aircraft pointed straight ahead despite the obstacles trying to pull her off course. At the 300-meter marker, halfway through her available runway, she was still carrying too much speed. The mathematics were brutally simple. She had 300 meters remaining and needed to dissipate the energy that would normally require twice that distance. This was the moment when textbook procedures became inadequate, when pilot intuition had to overcome engineering limitations. Vera made a decision that would have horrified her flight instructors. She applied maximum braking pressure, accepting the risk of blown tires in exchange for increased deceleration. The A-10's anti-skid system cycled rapidly, preventing wheel lockup while extracting every possible bit of stopping power from her aircraft's robust braking system. The sound was tremendous, squealing rubber, roaring engines at idle, and the distinctive whistle of her drag chute fighting the desert wind. 200 meters remaining. Her airspeed indicator showed 60 knots and decreasing, but the end of the runway was approaching with terrifying speed. A burned-out fuel truck marked her stop line, an immovable obstacle that would end her career and possibly her life if she failed to stop in time. Around the base perimeter, every person capable of movement had found a vantage point to watch the final moments of a landing that had already entered base legend. 100 meters, 50 knots. The mathematics of survival had narrowed to seconds and feet, with no margin for error remaining. Vera's aircraft shuddered to a stop with less than 20 meters of runway remaining, close enough to the burned fuel truck that she could read the tactical markings on its blackened hull through her forward windscreen. The sudden silence was almost overwhelming after the chaos of the emergency landing, engines at idle, drag chute billowing in the desert wind, and the subtle creaking of stressed metal settling into stillness. For a moment, nobody moved. The impossibility of what they had just witnessed left even seasoned military personnel struggling to process the evidence before their eyes. An A-10 Thunderbolt II sat motionless on a runway that every expert had declared unsuitable for fixed-wing operations, its pilot calmly running through post-landing checklists as if she had just completed a routine training flight. Staff Sergeant Santos was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Tombstone 27, Python lead. Welcome to Forward Operating Base Redemption. That was unfucking believable." Vera's response came with characteristic understatement, her voice steady and professional despite having just executed one of the most challenging landings in military aviation history. "Python lead, Tombstone 27 is down and stopped. Request ground power and fuel truck when available. Also need medical personnel standing by for patient transfer." As she began shutting down her engines, personnel from around the base converged on her aircraft. Captain Holloway jogged across the broken asphalt, his earlier skepticism replaced by something approaching reverence. Mechanics emerged from bunkers to examine an aircraft that had just redefined their understanding of what was possible. Medical personnel prepared stretchers for the wounded soldiers who would soon be evacuated to advanced trauma care. but it was Sergeant Major Rodriguez who reached her aircraft first, arriving just as Vera opened her canopy and began removing her helmet. His weathered face split into the first genuine smile he had managed since the Taliban attack, and his words carried the weight of a career spent watching impossible situations resolved by exceptional people. "Ma'am," he said, snapping to attention despite the informal nature of their surroundings, "I've got 32 years in this man's Air Force, and I've never seen anything like that. Not ever." Vera climbed down from her cockpit with movements that betrayed neither triumph nor false modesty. Her flight suit was dark with sweat, her hair matted from hours under a helmet, but her eyes held the quiet satisfaction of a professional who had done her job under impossible circumstances. She retrieved a small stone from the rocky ground beside her aircraft, a piece of Afghan granite worn smooth by wind and time, and slipped it into her breast pocket. "Sergeant Major," she replied, her voice carrying the understated confidence that had defined her career. "Sometimes the impossible is just another way of saying, not yet attempted. Now let's get those Marines ready for transport." Around the base, word of the landing spread with the speed of legend-making. Within hours, the story would reach headquarters through official channels and mess halls through unofficial ones, growing in the telling but never quite capturing the quiet professionalism with which Lieutenant Colonel Vera Kozlowski had just redefined what was possible. The wounded Marines were loaded aboard Vera's A-10 with the efficiency born of military training and humanitarian urgency. Staff Sergeant Martinez, the senior medic on base, supervised the delicate process of securing patients within the aircraft's limited passenger space, a configuration normally reserved for emergency evacuations when helicopters couldn't reach forward positions. The A-10 had been designed as a tank killer, not a medevac platform, but like everything else about this day, conventional wisdom had proven inadequate. "Lieutenant Colonel," Martinez said as he completed his patient checks, "these boys owe you their lives. Without advanced trauma surgery in the next 4 hours, we would have lost at least 2 of them." He paused, studying her face with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading people under stress. "That landing, ma'am, I've been deployed 6 times and I've never seen anything like it." Vera accepted the compliment with a slight nod, her attention already focused on the pre-flight inspection that would determine whether her battered aircraft could safely return to base with its precious cargo. The landing had stressed every system to its limits: tires that showed cord through worn rubber, brakes that radiated heat even an hour after touchdown, and landing gear that had absorbed impacts no engineer had ever designed them to handle. Captain Holloway approached as she knelt beside the left main landing gear, examining stress points with the methodical care of a pilot who understood that attention to detail meant the difference between successful missions and accident reports. His earlier skepticism had evolved into something approaching professional admiration, the grudging respect that one expert pays to another who has just demonstrated mastery beyond conventional limits. "Colonel Kozlowski," he began, his formal tone carrying weight that had been absent during their radio exchanges, "I owe you an apology. When I said no aircraft could land on this strip, I was speaking from experience and regulation. I wasn't accounting for—" He paused, searching for words adequate to describe what he had witnessed. "I wasn't accounting for exceptional piloting." Vera straightened from her inspection, wiping hydraulic fluid from her gloved hands. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the mountain peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber that softened the harsh edges of destruction surrounding them. Her aircraft sat like a metallic bird of prey among the debris, battle-scarred but functional, ready to carry its wounded cargo to safety. "Captain," she replied, her voice carrying the authority of rank but none of its arrogance, "experience and regulation exist to keep us alive in normal circumstances. But there's nothing normal about Marines bleeding out while medevac birds sit grounded." She gestured toward the aid station, where medical personnel continued their work with wounded who couldn't be moved. "Sometimes the book has to be rewritten in real time." As ground crews prepared her aircraft for departure, Vera walked the length of the damaged runway, studying the destruction with professional interest. The Taliban attack had been expertly planned and executed, designed to deny the base its tactical advantage while stranding personnel without air support. But the enemy planners had made the same assumption as Captain Holloway, that conventional limitations applied to unconventional situations. Her boots crunched on concrete fragments as she reached the point where her aircraft had touched down. The skid marks told the story of controlled desperation, black rubber streaks that marked the precise moment when physics and pilot skill had intersected at the edge of disaster. Looking back toward where her A-10 now sat, she calculated the distances involved and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. 640 meters from touchdown to full stop, with 20 meters to spare. The mathematics had been unforgiving, but mathematics yielded to determination when lives hung in the balance. Staff Sergeant Santos climbed down from the damaged control tower, his radio equipment slung over his shoulder as he prepared to coordinate her departure. His face showed the strain of a day that had tested every assumption about what was possible in his line of work, but also the relief of knowing that impossible missions could still have successful outcomes. Tombstone 27, we've got weather updates and clearance for your departure when ready, he reported, falling into step beside her as they walked back toward the aircraft. Medical facilities at Bagram are standing by for immediate trauma surgery. The engine start sequence aboard an A-10 Thunderbolt II was normally a routine procedure, but nothing about this day had followed normal parameters. As Vera ran through her checklist, each system response carried added significance. Engines that had performed flawlessly during an emergency landing, flight controls that had responded precisely when precision meant survival, and hydraulic systems that continued to operate despite stresses that exceeded design specifications. Her passengers lay secured in the aircraft's limited cargo area, their conditions stabilized but critical. Staff Sergeant Martinez had done everything possible with field medical equipment, but these Marines needed surgical intervention that could only be provided at a major medical facility. The weight of their lives added to her aircraft's gross weight, but more importantly, it added to the emotional weight of a mission that had already transcended normal operational parameters. Python lead, Tombstone 27 ready for departure, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. Taking off from a damaged runway was almost as challenging as landing on it, particularly with the additional weight of passengers and medical equipment. But the A-10 had been designed for exactly these conditions, short, rough field operations where conventional aircraft couldn't function. Tombstone, winds are light and variable, visibility unlimited. You are cleared for takeoff at pilot's discretion. Santos paused, then added words that carried the weight of personal respect earned through professional excellence. Ma'am, it's been an honor working with you today. As Vera advanced her throttles to takeoff power, the twin engines responded with their characteristic whine, a sound that had become synonymous with close air support and rescue missions throughout 2 decades of conflict. Around the base perimeter, personnel who had witnessed her impossible landing now gathered to watch an equally challenging departure. The mathematics of takeoff from a shortened runway required precise calculations of weight, wind, and runway length, but she had already proven that mathematics could be overcome by skill and determination. The A-10 began its takeoff roll with the deliberate acceleration of a heavily loaded aircraft pushing against the constraints of physics. Vera held the stick neutral until reaching rotation speed, then applied gentle back pressure to lift her aircraft from the damaged runway that had nearly become its grave. As the landing gear retracted and she climbed away from the valley floor, she caught a glimpse of personnel below waving from their positions, a gesture of respect that needed no radio transmission to convey its meaning. Python lead, Tombstone 27 is airborne and climbing. Thanks for the hospitality. Hope we get the chance to work together again under better circumstances. Roger that, Tombstone. Safe flight, and thank you for showing us that impossible is just another word for difficult. As she turned northeast toward Bagram Airfield, Vera reached into her breast pocket and felt the small stone she had collected beside her aircraft. It would join the others on her desk, marking another mission completed, another day when the impossible had yielded to determination and skill. The flight to Bagram Airfield took 47 minutes through mountain passes that had claimed aircraft and aircrew throughout decades of conflict in Afghanistan. But for Lieutenant Colonel Vera Kozlowski, this particular flight carried significance beyond mere transportation. In her cargo bay, 3 Marines fought for their lives while military medicine worked its quiet miracles, stabilizing wounds and maintaining vital signs until surgical intervention could complete what battlefield medicine had begun. At 15,000 feet above the Hindu Kush, she established radio contact with Bagram Approach Control, initiating the handoff from tactical operations to medical emergency. The controller's voice carried the professional efficiency of someone accustomed to handling aircraft bearing wounded personnel. But when she identified herself as the pilot who had landed at Forward Operating Base Redemption, even military professionalism couldn't entirely mask his surprise. Tombstone 27, Bagram Approach. We have your flight following and medical personnel standing by. Also have a message from Wing Command requesting immediate debrief upon your arrival. The controller paused, then added with barely contained curiosity, "Ma'am, is it true you landed an A-10 on a 600-meter damaged runway?" Bagram Approach, Tombstone 27. Runway length was 640 meters of usable surface. Landing was successful, patients are stable, aircraft is mission capable. Her response carried characteristic understatement, as if emergency landings on impossible runways were routine occurrences in her professional experience. The mountains below told their own story of conflict and endurance, snow-capped peaks that had witnessed the passage of armies and airmen, traders and warriors, throughout centuries of human ambition. For Vera, they represented something more personal, the landscape where her skills as a pilot had been tested against scenarios that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of training exercises and routine missions. As Bagram Airfield appeared on the horizon, its runway lights creating geometric patterns against the desert darkness, she began her descent into what would become the most significant debrief of her military career. Word of her landing had already reached higher headquarters through official channels and informal networks, generating interest from senior officers who understood that exceptional performance deserved recognition and analysis. Tombstone 27, Bagram Tower. You are cleared for straighten approach runway 27. Medical teams are in position for immediate patient transfer. Also be advised, General Harrison requests to see you immediately after patient handoff. General Patricia Harrison commanded the 455th Air Expeditionary Wing, and her reputation for demanding excellence from her aircrew was matched only by her support for those who delivered it. That she had requested an immediate meeting suggested that Vera's actions at Forward Operating Base Redemption had already reached the highest levels of command attention. The landing at Bagram was routine by comparison to her earlier performance, but routine felt strange after a day spent operating at the edge of possibility. As her aircraft rolled to a stop at the medical facilities, she could see teams of trauma surgeons and medical personnel already positioning themselves for immediate patient transfer. The choreography of military medicine was about to save lives that had been preserved by extraordinary piloting. Staff Sergeant Martinez, who had accompanied the wounded Marines during the flight, was the first to disembark as medical teams took custody of their patients. His face showed the strain of maintaining 3 critically injured soldiers during a flight through mountain turbulence, but also the relief of knowing they had reached definitive medical care. "Colonel," he said as stretcher teams moved with practiced efficiency, Those boys are going to make it because of what you did today. I don't know how you managed that landing, but I know Marines who are going to see their families again because of your skill." As the last patient was loaded into a waiting ambulance, Vera began her post-flight inspection with the methodical attention to detail that had characterized her entire career. The A-10 showed signs of its ordeal, stress marks on the landing gear, worn brake pads, and tire damage that would require replacement, but nothing that compromised its structural integrity. Like its pilot, the aircraft had performed beyond specifications when circumstances demanded exceptional performance. General Harrison appeared as Vera completed her inspection, approaching with the measured stride of a senior officer whose presence commanded attention without demanding it. Her uniform showed the insignia of a career spent in tactical aviation, and her expression carried the focused intensity of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected lives and missions. "Colonel Kozlowski," she began without preamble, "I've been briefed on your actions today. What I want to hear now is your assessment of what made that landing possible and whether it represents techniques that can be incorporated into our training programs." It was a question that cut to the heart of military aviation. The balance between calculated risk and reckless endangerment, between exceptional performance and dangerous precedent. The debriefing room at Bagram Airfield had witnessed thousands of mission analyses throughout years of combat operations, but the session that began at 1900 hours on that particular evening would be remembered as exceptional even by military standards. General Harrison had assembled a select group of senior aviators and safety specialists, each bringing decades of experience to the analysis of a landing that had already entered unofficial legend among forward deployed personnel. "Colonel Kozlowski," General Harrison began as the group settled around a conference table marked with coffee stains and the accumulated weight of countless tactical discussions. "Your actions today saved 3 lives, but they also raise questions about risk management and acceptable mission parameters. I want you to walk us through your decision-making process, from initial mission assignment through touchdown." Vera had anticipated this moment throughout her flight to Bagram, understanding that exceptional performance always generated scrutiny from those responsible for establishing standards and training procedures. Her response would influence not only her own career, but potentially the training of future pilots who might face similar circumstances. "General, my decision to attempt the landing was based on 3 factors: the critical medical condition of personnel on the ground, the absence of alternative evacuation methods, and my assessment that the A-10's performance characteristics made the landing technically feasible, though challenging." She paused, organizing her thoughts with the precision that had characterized her flight planning. The runway length was 640 meters of usable surface, with natural upslope that provided additional deceleration assistance. Colonel James Mitchell, the wing's chief of safety, leaned forward with the focused attention of someone whose job involved preventing accidents while enabling mission success. "Colonel, our technical manuals specify minimum runway requirements of 1,200 meters for A-10 operations. Your landing was accomplished with roughly half that distance. How do you reconcile your decision with established safety parameters?" The question struck at the fundamental tension between regulatory compliance and battlefield flexibility, the eternal challenge of balancing safety with mission accomplishment. Vera had wrestled with this balance throughout her approach to the damaged airfield, understanding that her decision would be judged not only by its outcome, but by its precedent. Technical manuals are written for normal operations under standard conditions. Forward operating base redemption presented neither normal conditions nor standard circumstances. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had calculated risks and accepted consequences. The A-10 was specifically designed for rough field operations in austere environments. My assessment was that this mission fell within the aircraft's performance envelope, though at the extreme edge of that envelope. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Davidson, the wing's operations officer, consulted her notes before posing the next question. Walk us through your approach technique. Standard procedures would have been inadequate for that runway length. What modifications did you make? This was the technical heart of the discussion, the analysis of procedures that could potentially be incorporated into emergency training programs. Vera pulled out her kneeboard cards, which contained the calculations and approach parameters she had developed during her flight to the base. I used a steep approach angle of 7 degrees, approximately twice the standard 3.5-degree glide path. This allowed me to minimize horizontal distance while maintaining aircraft control. Touchdown was planned for the first 50 meters of usable runway, accepting the risk of runway excursion in exchange for maximum stopping distance. She traced the approach profile on her kneeboard diagram, illustrating the mathematical precision that had made the impossible landing possible. General Harrison studied the calculations with the practiced eye of a pilot who understood that successful aviation was ultimately about managing risk through preparation and skill. Your approach technique appears sound, but it also requires pilot proficiency that exceeds normal training standards. How do we prepare pilots for scenarios like this without encouraging dangerous risk-taking? The question captured the essence of military aviation's eternal challenge, preparing aircrew for situations that existed beyond normal training scenarios while maintaining the safety standards that enabled routine operations. Vera's answer would help shape how the Air Force approached similar situations in the future. General, I believe this type of emergency landing should be incorporated into advanced training programs, but only for pilots who demonstrate exceptional proficiency in normal operations, she replied. The techniques involved aren't beyond our aircraft's capabilities, but they do require precise execution with no margin for error. As the debriefing continued into the evening, word of the extraordinary landing continued to spread throughout military aviation networks. By morning, the story would reach Pentagon briefing rooms and flight training facilities, becoming part of the institutional memory that shaped how military pilots approached seemingly impossible missions. But in the immediate moment, the focus remained on extracting lessons that could save future lives while maintaining the safety standards that made such lessons possible. Lieutenant Colonel Vera Kozlowski had not only completed an impossible landing, she had also begun the process of teaching others how impossibility could be overcome through skill, preparation, and carefully calculated courage. The analysis continued past midnight, with senior aviators dissecting every aspect of a landing that had redefined operational possibilities, while respecting the boundaries that kept such operations from becoming reckless endangerment. 3 weeks after the landing at Forward Operating Base Redemption, the story had evolved from tactical incident report to institutional case study, finding its way into briefing materials at the Air Force Weapons School and emergency procedures training programs throughout the service. But for Lieutenant Colonel Vera Kozlowski, the most meaningful recognition came in a different form entirely. A message from Staff Sergeant Martinez informing her that all 3 Marines had survived their surgeries and were expected to make full recoveries. The formal recognition ceremony took place at Bagram Airfield under a crystalline Afghan sky, with personnel from across the theater of operations gathered to witness an event that had grown beyond simple military decoration. General Harrison presided over the proceedings with the understated dignity that marked significant moments in military service, understanding that some achievements transcended routine recognition procedures. Ladies and gentlemen, the general began as assembled personnel came to attention. We are gathered today to recognize exceptional performance under combat conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Vera Kozlowski's actions on the 14th of this month exemplify the highest traditions of military aviation and the core values that define our service. Vera stood at attention in her dress uniform, feeling the weight of recognition that she had never sought but understood was part of military service. Around the assembled formation, she could see familiar faces,